does it really matter if the blogosphere gains continued influence? And by that I mean, is there anything that's really unique about the blogosphere and about bloggers and the way in which they talk about political events or organize politically? Is the only difference that they do it on the computer outside of DC versus over the television within the Beltway, or is there something unique about the way in which bloggers think about politics and talk about politics that really makes it significant that their voices are starting to be heard more? And then a secondary issue that's related to the first is, as the blogosphere becomes more accepted in the mainstream and more recognized, will it have an effect on, will it change the nature and character of the blogosphere? I mean, the blogosphere, I think, has been characterized by sort of outsider status and a dissatisfaction with the mainstream political structure. But if the blogosphere is kind of incorporated into the mainstream political structure, will the blogosphere just become another component of it, or will it preserve what makes it unique? And that, I think, is an issue that is on everyone's mind and has been sort of the conventional wisdom as the media talks about the blogosphere, that the blogosphere is being co-opted now by mainstream political forces. But I think it's a real question as to whether or not that's true. And I guess the third issue is, can the blogosphere even be discussed as an entity unto itself? Is the blogosphere a monolith that can be talked about with attributes and influence, or is it really nothing more than just a venue for all kinds of voices? I mean, there are 43 million blogs, and that doubles every 5 months or so. And is it possible to even talk about the blogosphere as an entity, or are there just multiple blogospheres that are sort of acting at cross purposes, and what does that mean if that's the case? So those are the issues that I think are really at the top of the agenda in terms of the importance of the blogosphere and its influence. And I like each panelist, starting with Jerome and working our way back, to sort of give their views on those topics and any others that they think are worthwhile. And we'll have a little bit of a discussion and then open up the discussion to questions. So, Jerome?
Thanks, Glenn. So, I've been blogging since 2001, and it's interesting because I've seen this question. There's a cycle around a few times since then of where's blogging going, and and I don't think it's an easy question, and certainly the answers get more complex. Let me just speak to a couple different articles that I noticed coming out of Yearly Coast, and sort of the journalist reaction, and then some thoughts of my own. Maureen Dowd wrote an article that looked at how bloggers she called them the new media, and labeled herself as old media, and it's sort of like, there's a cycle that goes on, or called a circle, I guess, where the new media kind of tries to become the old media. And she gave examples, Anna Marie Cox from Wonket, who now writes for Time magazine, and myself, I blogged on my idea, now I work on campaigns. I think there's a valid component there that is really difficult to understand, and certainly having been in the middle of it, it's sort of like straddling a fence, because it's really tough to, especially on campaigns, to straddle those two worlds, to try to blog, and ultimately you wind up commenting on your race, candidate that you're affiliated with or organization or something like that, and there, politics arise, and people, see conflict of interest and whatnot. So it's one of those questions that I don't think is going away, though, because bloggers have skills that are needed in campaigns and organizations. And then the second article it just came out in a Slate, I think it was this morning, that was an article that was looking at all the hype of the reporters that were in Yearly Coast, and there were a lot. There were 140 reporters there, which is like one for every 8 people that attended the event. At one point I remember Maureen Dowd there, Adam Gurney, and Matt By, and I'm getting cornered by him. Quite the experience. So this article from Slate was basically like saying, there's sort of a love fest right now with the press and the blogs, and they're kind of building them up, but they're going to turn on them. And it was, what the guy gave as the turning point would be when the Democrats didn't win in 2006, that it would be the blog's fault. And anybody that's read Crashing the Gate knows that, well, we're responsible for this mess. We don't even have much of a role in being able to fix it yet. But so that was the turning point that he mentioned. So I think both those perspectives they're really grappling for it. When I talked to the press there, and they were trying to understand the blogs, I asked them, well, do you ever go and read the comments? Oh no, I don't go and read the comments, just the top ones. And so it's tough to get a grasp on what's going on in the blogosphere if you're not really participating in it. And I don't think much of the press does. I think they try to skim it over the top and try to draw some conclusions and go with it. But here's sort of my take on where it's at. I still think the medium is very young, and I don't know. The readership is probably around right now 4 or 5 million, maybe. I saw one poll that said among Democrats, self-identified Democrats, that 10 million people went to political blogs like once a week or so, which is a lot of people, much more than we had. Like say in 2003, when during Howard Dean's campaign, it's probably about 10 to 20 times larger than that. But the real growth that I've seen is in the local area. Certainly there's been national blogs that have come up on the scene and sort of filled niches. I mean, Christy's here with Firedoglake, and that was a blog that wasn't even around a year ago, I don't think, was it?
Actually, it was. Jane started it in the end of November of 2004, but she and I just started blogging together like September, October of 2005.
Well, yeah, okay.
But when we started, we had, maybe 3,000 readers
Right.
a day, and we're well above that now.
Okay. And John Model with Crooks and Liars is another one that's sort of popped into the big blogs. So I think the situation is very dynamic, even on the big blogs, but it's at the local level with the, and I really noticed this when I was out on the book tour when Marcus and I went to, 35 cities in 20 days or something crazy like that. But meeting all the bloggers in these different areas was really a unique experience to, go into these places and meet with them and get the rundown, put faces on these, lesser blogs that were getting, 1,000 or 2,000 readers a day, or even less. And seeing the growth that was happening there. And, one of the things that we've pushed on the blog successfully this year is Democrats competing in all of the races that we can, trying to field a candidate against a Republican everywhere. And that's it. The organizing capability for blogs is really, the fallback or the strength of a lot of those races nationwide. There's nothing really else that they have that's pushing forward their candidacy. So that's a vital component of it. And the other thing I'll just comment on is the blogosphere as a whole. I've seen a map of like the political blogs, and I think it was Blog Post that did it last year that had all the links that went through from the Democratic side and the Republican side, and it's very few in between. But I would think it would be really interesting to look at the sort of the entire blogosphere, because there's a lot of, we call them spheres or whatever, out there that are not political, but that people are communicating, and it's sort of strange that we don't. Politics goes on there, but it goes on there at a much different, interaction level than it is on the political blogs. But I think that's just a whole other level of trying to understand this medium, that realizing that people are out there interacting on blogs more than ever. I was reading in the Wall Street Journal this morning about the advertising shifts. Just this year, 15% of the big corporations have pulled out of television advertising. 15% of their budgets to go into the internet. So this is a huge shift ongoing right now, and there's there's a lot of things to look at.
Excellent, thank you, Matt. Oh, no, thank you, Jerome, Matt.
Yeah, I was like, thank you for feeding my ego. Appreciate that. So I do think of myself very much as a novice. I grew up in suburban Miami, and when I grew up, it was all the driving culture and the television culture, and when I was, either my parents driving me around or I was driving around. I looked at the highways and the buildings and things around me, and I was like, well, all of this stuff sort of is placed here by natural law. I never actually thought that people made choices about where these things were built. I didn't think about the architecture of the society that I was living in. It just was there, and there were things you could buy at the store, and there were jobs that you could get, and that's kind of how things were organized. I was a complete consumer. I had never even considered how political choices are made, and I really didn't consider that until I started blogging in 2002. So, the system worked for me, and I went to college and I had a fortunate upbringing and everything like that, but I had never actually considered power until I started blogging, and I think that's pretty significant, and I think it's significant for a number of reasons. To me, what the blogosphere means is a shift of power, and the original political blogs emerged after 9/11, and they were right-wing blogs, and they were consistently talking about, how liberals were dating terrorists all the time or something, and it's important to recognize who those people were, because they are very powerful people. They're people who have existing access to power, law professors and right-wing think tank. We call them, wingnut welfare? Those types of people who have access to the halls of power. And the next group of people to start blogging were the liberal bloggers, and we have, sort of slightly less power, but we're still, I'm still in a fortunate position in the society. But what you're seeing over time is more and more disempowered groups coming online and starting to, use words to take power, and I think that's really important. I see blogs as representative of reform movements. We've taken on single issue groups, which I think is really important. We've taken on dying local and state parties with organizations like Drinking Liberally and other DFA and other groups that are organizing and on a local level and providing a social structure for a real reform movement. And I think you're going to continue to see moves towards reform. And I just got a mean email from Mike McCurry, which I'm sort of amused about because I've been involved in this net neutrality fight. But I think one of the things that's happened is that the Democratic Party structure has forgotten that words matter and has forgotten that actions have consequences, and they think it's all spin. They think it's all PR. What blogs are is a traditional American response to that problem. Words do matter. Actions do have consequences, and we are constantly pointing them out. I was in Las Vegas at Yearly Coast, which was a phenomenal conference, but I went over to the YDA conference, and a speaker who was a congresswoman was talking, and she said, this administration wants to criminalize dissent, or wants to make dissent unpatriotic or something. And I was like, that's not true. This administration does want to make dissent unpatriotic. They do want to jail journalists. But during the Iraq War, it wasn't just the administration that was doing it. It was Democratic leadership. It was Democrats who were doing it too, and it was Americans who were doing it. And fundamentally, what the blogs are a response to that, a response to the structural failure that caused Democratic leaders to parrot not just right-wing talking points, but to parrot a very extreme right-wing takeover of society. Because when we don't stand up, and this is what blogs suggest to me, then bad people take power, and we are a response to that. We've seen structural failures in the progressive movement all over the place, really bad ones, and we're starting to talk about those, and it's not pleasant, but that's what we really are doing. But to make it a little bit broader and to talk about blogs as a sociological institution or whatever, I just used a big word. I really think that blogs are a sketch of, because of my experience coming from a suburban kid who never understood that highways weren't built by God, but were built by people with very nasty agendas to divide society. I think that blogs are just a sketch of a new politics. They're a sketch of what a new establishment that actually wields power responsibly might look like. They're not the whole thing. I think we're at the very beginning stages, but you're seeing the development of a producer culture, a move away from consumerism, and you see it with things like MySpace and YouTube and blogs and just email, just the ability for people to communicate instead of having this crushing mass communication society on top of them without any outlet. And it's really important, these developments, and that's one of the reasons. It's completely changed, just personally, it's completely changed the way that I see my life. It's completely changed the way that I see politics. and it's completely changed the way that I see social organizations and institutions. So, there's enormous amounts of power online that are just waiting to be taken. And I think what you're seeing up here are the sort of the first stabs at moving in that direction. But you're going to see just a lot more, and it's going to be really interesting. It may not be good, because when you have massive economic dislocation, other things that are coming, weird things happen in the political system. But moving from a consumer to a producer culture is something that's happening right now. The blogs are a representation of that, as are other groups that aren't getting as much attention. So that's what I would say about the answer to your questions.
Thank you, Matt. Christy?
Morning. I haven't had nearly enough coffee, and my voice is still kind of gone from yearly coast, so I'm going to try to speak into the mic as much as possible so you guys can hear me. When Glenn introduced me this morning, he talked about the fact that I'm a lawyer, that I'm a former prosecutor, and I'm a mom. And the reason that I got started blogging really is because I'm a mom. My husband and I spent a long time trying to have a child and had some problems with that, and finally had our little miracle girl in 2003. And, I'd always been very politically aware. I'd always been one of those people that watched a lot of the political shows on TV on Sunday morning and yelled at Pat Buchanan whenever he came on. And, things pissed me off in the paper, but I never really did a lot about it. I mean, I would work for a local candidate here and there, or I would occasionally send a letter to the editor in, one of them, smacking somebody around, the other one agreeing with something, whatever. But I never really did, anything in any organized fashion about politics until our daughter was born. I held her and I looked at her and I thought, George Bush is president of the United States, and I've got to do something about that. It was bad enough when it was just affecting me, but hello. I got started working for the Kerry campaign, just in my local area, working for the Kerry folks who staff the office there. And, I would pop her in the stroller and we'd go out strolling around neighborhoods and passing out flyers, and knocking on doors and making phone calls. And she'd help reorganize the pens in the Kerry office while I was on the phone. And, the election did not turn out so well. As some of you may know. And afterward, I was just really pissed off for a couple of months. And when I say really pissed off, I mean to the point that my husband was like, I think you need to go talk to somebody about this. Pissed off. I mean, it was very depressing, and I was very angry, and I just kept thinking of all the consequences for my child, and how, things needed to change, but they weren't being changed, and why couldn't everybody just wake up? So then I thought, I'll just, get online and see what's out there. And I stumbled across Daily Kos and, would post here and there as a commenter, and finally got up the nerve to post my first diary one day. And my blog partner, Jane Hampshire, and I met because of the Fitzgerald investigation. She and I would constantly be on the same threads talking about the nitpicky little minutia of the case. And we started emailing back and forth, and then we exchanged phone numbers, and then we'd be on the phone for 2 hours talking about some news article, and we realized that our mutual obsession probably should develop into more of a relationship, and we started blogging together. It really has been a blessing for me, not just because, I get to vent, but also because my husband's a lot happier because I'm not venting to him. In terms of the blogging, I mean, it really is such an amazing conversation. I mean, I don't know how many of you have visited Firedoglake, but we have amazing commenters on our site, and it's an ongoing conversation on a constant basis. That really is more like a virtual town square, like back in the 1700s when, America was first getting started. People would meet in the town square and they would talk over the political issues of the day. And, as we've gotten more suburban and things have gotten more spread out, you don't have the opportunity to do that as much in most towns. And, frankly, there's not as much of a community feel in most places. Now, I live in West Virginia, so we're still pretty much small town America where I live. And there still is that kind of community feel, but you don't always get that everywhere. But, on a blog, you do kind of get your own little family going on, and each blog has its own character and their own means of discussion, and I think that's fantastic. especially because the conversation evolves. You know, you don't just start with a political fiat from the top down. It's an evolving and constant conversation, and I think that's really the best part of blogging. And I know Glenn's commenters are the same, are very similar to what we have in terms of content. Digby did a post for us yesterday because I was driving out here and couldn't do my usual post, and was talking about the fact that the real story of what made the yearly Coast Convention so exceptional was a question that the reporters who were there covering it, who kept swarming around Jerome and Marcos like locusts. I mean, it really was amazing. You'd see them going down the hall just to go to the bathroom, and the swarm of people following along behind them everywhere they went. And you know, it was really, you know, I mean, I don't know how you guys dealt with it. I really don't. But you know, what Digby was saying in the post on our blog yesterday was that the real story was what made the ordinary people who weren't big name bloggers, who, you know, just read, and I think somebody was telling me 25% of the people who attended were people who'd never even posted a comment. They were just people who, you know, are termed as lurkers on the blog. What made them spend their hard-earned money to go to Yearly Coast? That's the story. You know, what is it that makes people want to have a political voice? And I think it is the fact that most of us feel like we've been shut out. But the truth is, the politicians work for us. It's not the other way around. And the blogs give us an opportunity to remind them of that, sometimes in a very snarky tone, that they work for us. And I think that's where the real power of blogging comes in.
Thank you, Christy. Chris?
I'm Chris Rabb, and I've been blogging since late 2003, although I would probably say that Christy has blogged more in less time than I have in the years that I have been online, probably because I've only kind of tactically called myself a blogger. I really don't consider myself a blogger because the origins of Afro-Netizen was really an informal email list. And in '99, I just was sending out, I was, you know, doing copyright infringement. I was taking cool articles and sending them to my friends and family and classmates. And people were devouring it as though I had written it, you know, even though it said New York Times or Mother Jones or whatever. And people were starving for information that really gravitated towards concerns that otherwise mainstream media wasn't covering consistently or centrally. And my constituency represented what I would consider intellectually curious, civic-minded black folk in urban centers around the country. You know, that's the community from which I come. And I was raised, and it sounds like a little different than Matt's background as a suburbanite. I grew up in Chicago in a family that was very political, extended family, and I learned at a very early age that one, life is not fair, and two, that everything is a political act. And so growing up with community activists, with people who run for political office and most of the time lost because of their insurgent views, anti-machine views, anti-racist views, created a context in which I thought that how I would use the internet when I came to it in '95 would somehow manifest in a political activity. And thus Afro-Netizen was born a few years later, and within about 18 months we went from about 100 folks to 10,000 people. And as I traveled the country on business and you know, just pleasure, if I were in a group of black folk, a dozen or more, who I didn't know, and they would see my name or hear my name and say, "You're Afro-Netizen." And I realized that beyond the 10,000 or so folks who were subscribers to my Yahoo list, I get Yahoo group at the time in 2000, 2001, were, you know, generations of black folk who were receiving the email that was forwarded to them by my subscribers. And it really was a resonant and powerful experience for me. It was very humbling because I realized that there was no home for black folk online who were interested in political information. I didn't consider blackentertainmenttelevision.com to be the source of progressive information. Black Planet, which was founded by a buddy of mine, we used to sell t-shirts together. That's more kind of social dating stuff. So that was not quite the demographic I was looking for. My folks ended up being around 30 to 50 years old. A lot of people assume that I was reaching younger folks because younger folks are digital and savvy. No, it was. I really wasn't talking to the hip-hop generation. I get that a lot because they think because I have a predominantly black readership, oh, the hip-hop, yeah, but it's more Matt Stoller's demographic who are going to be, the consumers of hip-hop are more suburban young white men and boys than it is the folks who were on my list, and so people really didn't exist.
All right, maybe not.
But, that's not a value judgment. That's just a statement of. I love the hip hop with the young people. I love it with the funny beats. My wife is going to kill me. She wrote a book on hip hop, but that really wasn't the demographic. And another assumption people made was that Afro-Netizen was really kind of represent the talented 10th, so-called talented 10th of black community. So, and even though it skews to highly educated folk, it represents a great diversity in terms of socioeconomic background. And not everyone is from urban areas, even the majority is, but there are folks from all over. And it's interesting when the types of things that get the greatest response. The execution of Tukey Williams was huge. Bill Cosby denigrating poor people was huge, and there was incredible discussions about that on both sides of the fence. But I guess what I want to say with regard to our conversation about the blogosphere and the kind of the so-called progressive political blogosphere is that, to me, I see that this is really an extension of an existing paradigm. It's not a paradigm shift, it's a medium shift. We're using new tools to have amplified conversations that tend to be more partisan than what happens at your typical cocktail party or, PTA meeting, what have you. And that's okay as long as we recognize that, because if you look at the demographics and